Okay, part two of today's lecture is let's think a little bit about what this idea of adulthood is, and to kind of go into what youth studies has to say about this. So, one of the kind of quotes I like to use about this is from an Australian philosopher called Clive Hamilton, who was on a news program once, who was talking about kind of the notion of consumerism. And he kind of argued that, it seems that the modern day adult today is trapped in a huge mortgage, gets married because they think they have to, is kind of trapped in a job they hate to buy stuff they don't need to impress people they don't like. Now, it's a rather kind of, I suppose, cynical and a little bit kind of funny way of thinking about it. But it's one way to think about kind of what are the dominant norms of adulthood, and many of those things seem to kind of ring quite true. So, this youth-adult binary, as much of the youth studies research is showing, is becoming blurry, if not increasingly irrelevant. And that's because, as I said previously, those kind of key markers of what we used to call adulthood are happening later in life. Now, they're not happening because young people are irresponsible. They're not happening because young people are lazy or making the wrong choices or they're immoral or all these things. They're happening because of a whole set of social, cultural, economic and political changes. So what we find in the literature is that some people argue that young people growing up early, in this sense, they're kind of faced with more kind of, adult kind of things earlier in life, whether that's sex and drugs and alcohol. They have to seem to decide what career they want to take on from almost kindergarten today. And then there's those wider kind of, global risks like terrorism and global warming and stuff like that young people and children are exposed to from an early age through the media. So that's kind of, one way of thinking about it. And there's a lot of moral panics around that as well in terms of the sexualization of children and that kind of thing. But there's also other work that says that maybe young people are growing up later, that we're all growing up later, that we're entering the full-time labour market, or the labour market at all a lot later. People are studying now all throughout their life, so that kind of demarcation between being a student and having a job is increasingly blurry because we have to seem to be lifelong learners. The notion that we live independently from your family or your parents or whatever is increasingly difficult. Young people are moving out of the household a lot later in life, largely due to having to study a lot more, or the kind of the rise of housing markets and stuff like that. And people are having children and getting married much later as well. Now again, much of the kind of youth studies literature says that, again, these things aren't about young people choosing to be irresponsible or, concentrating on consumption or, buying too much avocado on toast. It's about kind of how economic changes almost engender these things. So, maybe deciding to get married later or having kids later in life, whether it's in the 30s or even into the 40s now, may be a sensible decision if you don't have the economic independence to be able to do it before then. So again, there's this tension in the youth studies literature about growing up early or growing up later. Certainly those markers of adulthood are happening later. What's also interesting here is the notion of youth culture and how that's changed. Where in the past maybe people participated in forms of youth culture and maybe stopped, in their mid-20s as they got married, had kids and that kind of thing, it's increasingly the norm now for people to participate in forms of youth culture later in life. So, the idea that you would, maybe go to gigs or whatever and just stop doing that once you turn 30 or whatever isn't really the norm anymore. People are doing that a lot later throughout their lives, and their lifestyles are changing because of that. So here, Hodgson's and Bennett's work around what they call growing old disgracefully is really interesting to think about that. Does youth culture actually stop now, or is it kind of a thing that people participate in throughout their lives? So in terms of ways of thinking about this, there's some key theoretical stuff that in sociology that's been quite important in youth studies, particularly the work from Ulrich Beck around risk, society, reflexivity and individualisation, and I think those that have done Soccer 101 would have looked at in semester one. And in youth studies, the work of Furlong and Cartmel has kind of brought this into a kind of dominant way of thinking about what's happening in young people's lives. They argued that young people are faced with what they called an epistemological fallacy. That from an early age, young people are socialised into this world where they're told that it's meritocratic, that it's classless, that if they work hard enough and they make the right choices, that they'll be able to achieve their ambitions and their dreams. But throughout their own observations, their own experiences, throughout that socialising period, from kindergarten through school out into the labour market, it seems that the actual experience of the world largely contradicts this. That you can make the right choices, you can work very hard at school, you can get the right degree, but then go out into the labour market and find that very difficult to, get full-time work, to not have to do, free internships and volunteer work and stuff like this. So here young people are kind of juxtaposed in terms of the promises they're sold from an early age and their actual experience. So here we get the notions of reflexivity, detraditionalisation and individualisation, very key sociological concepts. Reflexivity, the idea that we have to increasingly make judgments of ourselves, almost step outside of ourselves and make choices about how we can make our lives better. Detraditionalisation, the way that maybe the strictures of gender and race and class have somewhat lessened as there's been kind of political emancipation and also the rise of consumerism. But those kind of problems still maintain as key contours of inequality as well. And there's individualisation, a particularly important way of thinking about how the blame for social ills are largely placed on the individual today. So this kind of makes us think about the very idea of choice. Young people are put under pressure from really early age to make the right choices, whether it's do your homework or do the right subjects at university or whatever, and all that kind of thing, not to party and all that kind of thing. But we kind of need to maybe disassociate the notion of choice and freedom, and these theorists kind of point to the idea that maybe the increase of the importance of choice in our lives leads to more insecurity, more anxiety. Here, precarity is now the norm for even the well-educated middle classes. The labour market has fundamentally changed in the risk society, where even those with university degrees face precarious labour market conditions. So there's an example there for you to have a look at about the labour market, how class still plays a real key role in terms of how people get employed or who gets employed. So in terms of the youth transitions field in youth studies, which has been a real key area of study within it, there's been kind of three specific transitional, I suppose, trajectories that have been used to study this period: the school to work transition, the careers; the domestic transition, which is about relationships; and housing transitions, which is about kind of getting more independent. And what the field has essentially posed over the past couple of decades is it's no longer a straight line. That transition period doesn't just happen like as a narrative, a straight narrative anymore, that it's much more complex, that there's a zigzag, people might take one step forward, one step back, the lines between, moving forward are getting increasingly blurry. And these changes in young people's biographies reflect these wider changes in the labour market and the economics. So here we see the rise of notions of becoming and belonging being very important in youth studies. So to sum up part two here, I've spoken a little bit about what it means to be an adult, whether we need to really kind of reinvent the very idea of what adulthood means. And this kind of has to be the case as those key markers are happening later and later in life. Sometimes we argue that young people are growing up early, sometimes they're growing up later, so there's a real kind of tension going on there between those things. And that the Risk Society thesis, particularly through the work of Furlong and Cartmell's very influential book, has been a kind of genesis in the way to think about this in terms of the theory, that young people are born into this risk society, that they have to make choices increasingly as individuals, blame for things like unemployment and the likes of that in terms of economic causes are increasingly receding to the background, and young people are encouraged from an early age to kind of think about themselves as individuals in competition with everyone else. You need to make the right choices and work hard and everything will be okay, but their experiences of the world don't really reflect that. And for theorists and youth researchers, that are influenced by this point of view, it sees a rise of insecurity and anxiety and depression and mental health stuff. So the very field of youth transitions has been a key in youth studies, and in some ways you could argue that its own findings are kind of making the field irrelevant, that maybe that transition thing isn't a kind of good metaphor for thinking about that trip from being a child to an adult in terms of people's social progression, and that maybe we need to think of other concepts today to get an understanding of what it means to be in this liminal period between child and adult as it seems to extend further and further out into the into people's older age. Okay, thanks.